Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's webinar, Advocacy for Women, Working Parents and Guardians, Confronting the Inequities Spotlighted by the Pandemic. This is the third webinar in a series of 3 devoted to supporting mothers and parents in their many roles during the pandemic, co-hosted by Alma Maters and Beyond Barnard. As a quick reminder, this event is being recorded. Attendees will not have microphone or camera access during this online event, so your voices, likenesses, and images will not be captured by Barnard. Written submission of questions may be shared during the Q&A portion of the program. My name is Christine Valenza-Shin. I am Associate Dean of Beyond Barnard, the college's hub for advising and resources around careers, internships, competitive fellowships, and applications to graduate and professional schools. Beyond Barnard supports students and alumni as they define, pursue, and achieve success in their careers and communities. I'm also an alum of the college, proud member of the class of 1984. The mission of Alma Maters, our co-host, is to provide mothers with thoughtful discussion and programming on all aspects of parenting and work-life balance by hosting presentations, workshops, and discussions that span the years of parenting from prenatal to college-aged children. And now I am delighted to introduce tonight's panelists. Madeleine Gyory, Barnard class of 2010, is a women's rights attorney and writer. During her time at NYU Law School, graduating in 2017, Madeleine worked with the ACLU Women's Rights Project on pregnancy discrimination and NYU's Reproductive Justice Clinic on federal constitutional litigation. After law school graduation, she served as the NYU Reproductive Justice and Women's Rights Fellow at A Better Balance, working on implementation and public outreach for New York's paid family leave law and other workplace protections for caregivers. She then worked for the NYC Commission on Human Rights, combating discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations. Gloria Pan, class of 1986, is a mission-oriented campaign strategist and organizer with more than 20 years of experience in the progressive space, advocating for women and families, civil rights, gun violence prevention, and economic justice. She currently serves as Vice President of Member Engagement and Campaign Innovations at MomsRising, a national progressive advocacy organization. Prior to MomsRising, Gloria was principal for internet communication strategy at Turner Strategies, where she conceived and helped found the influential 2009 FEM 2.0 conference and the FEM 2.0 online community. As communications director for the Media Futures think tank, the Institute for the Connected Society, she had a front row seat to the rise of the internet and helped build the We Media conferences into a must-attend event for the media vanguard. She also, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Gloria was a management trainee and currency trader for JP Morgan. She also holds a master's degree in economic development from Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. And Lynn Yellen, class of 1985, a social studies teacher in New York City public high schools for more than 30 years, studied, taught, and developed curricula on movements for social change. She continues to teach today. In June 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, Lynn created the newsletter Work from Home for Justice to mobilize readers to educate themselves about racial injustice and take daily actions. Because of the extraordinary events of the last 15 months, the civil rights unrest, the assault on democracy, and the context of the pandemic and the climate crisis, she now writes about a broad range of justice issues, including the care economy, voting rights, educational and health equity, sustainability, food justice, anti-racism, and reparations. So welcome to all 3 of you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to jump in and ask some questions, get the conversation going. I want to use the subtitle of our event, Confronting the Inequities Spotlighted by the Pandemic, as sort of a before, during, and after framework for the discussion here tonight. Major ongoing inequities for working mothers and families existed before COVID, obviously, have been exacerbated and exposed during the worst of the pandemic, and obviously continue as we transition to the next phase, whatever that will entail. So I want to start with the before and have each of you tell us more about your advocacy work pre-COVID. What issues and problems were you most focused on, and what challenges and successes kept you going? So let me go ahead. I'll start with Madeleine. Madeleine.
Great. Thank you, Christine, and thank you so much for having me. So I went to NYU Law School with the intent of working on reproductive rights and justice, including issues affecting working parents and caregivers. And when I graduated from law school, I was working for an organization called A Better Balance, that is a legal advocacy organization that fights for laws to protect parenting and pregnant workers from discrimination. So when I was there, I worked a lot on New York's paid family leave law, which had just been passed. And I spoke to a lot of workers, healthcare professionals, employers about what the law meant and how workers could apply for benefits and exercise their rights. So I also gave trainings and know your rights trainings in the law and helped do some public outreach to kind of get the word out there about this new law and these new rights that it created. And after that, I was working at the New York City Commission on Human Rights for a while, where I was enforcing the city's anti-discrimination law, which is a very broad discrimination law, and particularly looking at discrimination against pregnant workers and discrimination based on sex and disability. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. Did you say a challenge and success, or should I wait for that one?
No, you can say that too. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, one of the biggest challenges in my work was that I think law school did not prepare me for at all was the fact that when a law is passed, it doesn't mean that everybody knows about it. And so, almost as important as passing progressive policies is really having an outreach and education part of the implementation and letting people know how they can actually exercise their new rights, particularly where the policy puts a lot of responsibility on individuals to exercise their rights, like asking for an accommodation in the workplace or applying for benefits. So that was a big challenge.
Any sort of pre-COVID successes that stand out?
I mean, the other side of that coin is that when I was at A Better Balance, I talked to a lot of people and helped them figure out how they could take their leave and talk to their boss about taking leave. And it's really empowering to be able to advocate for yourself instead of involving the formal legal system and having to expend all the time and resources of doing that. So anytime I could help someone get their benefits, talk to their supervisor or HR, that was a huge success.
That's great. I'll go to Gloria now. Same question. What did you sort of focus on advocacy-wise pre-COVID?
Thank you. So first of all, I'm really happy to have this opportunity to be with the Barnard community. My Barnard education was really foundational for me, and it helped me find meaning and direction in how I wanted to live my life, which ultimately led to my work as an issue advocate for women and families. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with my organization, MomsRising, we are a national on-the-ground and online organization of more than 1 million moms and family members across the country. We're working to build a nation where everyone can thrive. And we were founded on family pocketbook issues like paid family leave, paid sick days. But over time, we've become like an umbrella organization for the leading issues impacting families at any given time. So for example, during the Obama years, our healthcare campaign helped pass the Affordable Care Act. And in the Trump years, our immigration campaign aggressively pushed back against family separation. At MomsRising, I am the Vice President of Campaign Innovations and Member Engagement, and I also lead the gun control campaign. So prior to the pandemic, 2020, I was focused on democracy. I was specifically working on helping to get out the vote for the 2020 elections. Our Moms Vote campaign was multi-layered, very complex, and it targeted low voting moms in swing states. Immediately after the election, with the change in the balance of power in the White House and Congress, we had leaders, we thought, that were more supportive of smart science-based public policy and more supportive of women and families. And so we quickly pivoted to focus on new opportunities we saw on the horizon, opportunities such as advancing policies like paid family leave and access to healthcare and also gun policy reform. And we thought we would be returning to a more advocacy as usual environment, but then COVID happened. Prior to COVID, I guess the big success would be the elections. We had a very successful Get Out the Vote program. We feel like we moved towards a power structure that was more amenable to the policies that we're trying to pass. And I keep going because I'm in advocacy and every day seems like a fire drill. and you can't stop, right? Democracy is not a spectator sport. So we keep going and we keep fighting and we hope for something better.
And Lynn, fill us in on your pathway pre-COVID.
So I would say that before COVID, my advocacy and activism was principally influenced by my experience as a teacher and the issues that affected my students most directly at any given moment. Initially, I was involved in anti-poverty efforts and LGBTQ rights, including advocacy around AIDS and health access. ACT UP's message, silence equals death, really influenced me to become an advocate for equitable healthcare access as well as immigrant rights. Over time, I found that I was more interested in working with young people setting the agenda of what needed doing. And that took me in some interesting directions. A number of years ago, a 9th grader approached me and said, I want to start a feminist club. And I didn't really know what she had in mind. But for the next 5 or so years, which were the last of my public school teaching career, I had young people in my classroom at lunch and after school talking about a wide range of issues, the dress code, disciplinary action. It's interesting to me that Madeleine mentioned implementation, because what happened is that we had policies at school that would appear to be neutral with regard to gender equity, but in fact, in the implementation of those policies and the enforcement of those policies, that's where things got really dicey. And the most memorable event that came out of the Feminist Club is that in 2018, the students decided to host their own Me Too event. And they invited staff as well as students into the same safe space. They set the protocols, and it was an unforgettable turning point in the culture of the school to be having those conversations in school. Some of the other issues that I've really enjoyed working on with young people are the fight against school segregation, the retire segregation movement that wanted to mark the 65th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Ed, the very long struggle for fair funding for New York schools, public schools. And, we've just had a big victory in that regard because, finally, the state is releasing funds to the city. So we have a very flush year in the public schools. And of course, Black Lives Matter, which, again, as a public school teacher, this brought up a set of issues that were impossible not to talk about all the time. So that's what I've been up to before COVID.
Right. So next up, talking a little bit about when COVID hit, how did the onset of the pandemic impact your advocacy work and focus, and how have things evolved over the past year and a half? And I think I threw in a follow-up question there, if there was a particular story, circumstance, or statistic that became a light bulb moment for you during this time. So I think I'll start with Gloria this time.
Okay, so in a way, my job at MomsRising puts me in the eye of the storm. The pandemic really brought into relief how our economy and society have put women and families last. As the pandemic unfolded from across the country, we heard from our members literally panicking because they were barely making it work. They were homeschooling during the day, working at night, and that's only if they've had a job and one that let them work from home. There was the deafening silence of essential workers who had nothing left over to even cry for help. They were facing stark choices, reducing their hours or quitting to be able to take care of their kids, and many were living on the edge of financial devastation. the pandemic really highlighted the disproportionate amount of caregiving that falls to women. And as a result, women lost many of the gains that we've made in the workforce. We lost 4.6 million payroll jobs, and a full 32% of women aged 25 to 44 said that access to childcare was one of the reasons for that unemployment, with Black, Indigenous, and women and moms of color experiencing the most devastating economic harms. To put all of this into perspective, women were half of our paid labor force at the start of the pandemic, but job rates for women plummeted to 1988 levels during the pandemic, with women losing 1 million more jobs than men, and women of color disproportionately experiencing higher rates of job losses. For me, I don't think I had one light bulb moment. Instead, I think I experienced growing awareness of how things are just so unsafe for women in general in America. You know, in addition to economic insecurity, the pandemic also highlighted threats to mental health and also to our personal safety. And that's like literally true. So for example, domestic violence spiked over the course of the pandemic. 1 in 3 white women have reported experiencing domestic violence. But for those marginalized by race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, citizenship status, and disability, the rates of abuse have increased dramatically. So it's just been this sort of slow, not slow, but steady awakening, like even more awareness of how women are unsafe. And as a country, we need to really do better.
Madeleine?
Yeah, I just want to echo a lot of what Gloria has said. You know, I think having worked in the area of policies that help working people and pregnant people and caregivers, we were already in a crisis before the pandemic happened. It's just that it was not a policy priority or a political priority for lawmakers nationally and in a lot of the country. So, I mean, almost a silver lining of this has been the kind of ripping off the veil to say, yes, there is a crisis of care. There actually has been a crisis of care for a long time, pre-pandemic. It's just impossible to ignore it now. You know, one concrete example or one kind of light bulb moment for me was when I was at A Better Balance. One of the things that we were advocating for was a paid sick day law at the state level in New York State, which was something that advocates have been working for years and years. New York City has a paid sick day law on the books since 2014, but if you work outside of New York City, you know, and you had to take a sick day, you were not guaranteed that it was going to be paid, and you were not guaranteed that you were not going to be fired. You know, but we had a lot of pushback. There was a lot of pushback from the business lobby, from employers who did not want a law guaranteeing just 5 paid sick days a year. And it just seemed like an impossibility, at least in the short term. And then suddenly when the pandemic started, we saw, I think in March of 2020, the state passed an emergency paid sick time law that just applied to COVID and quarantining. And then less than a month later, they passed a permanent paid sick time law. So within the span of 1 month, they accomplished what advocates had been pushing for years and years. You know, so it's just kind of a light bulb moment of, oh, you know, just because something's not a policy priority now, it doesn't mean that it you know, it won't be. Should it have taken a pandemic to make that happen? No. You know, but that was kind of a light bulb moment for me, that sudden shift.
And Lynn?
Well, I can't help but agree that the crisis in care was the dramatic highlight of the pandemic. It was the big shift. So one of the things that it showed was the extent to which schools provide so many necessary services, right? From meals to counseling. And even with the systemic problems of racism and segregation that plagued the schools, when the schools shut down suddenly on March 16th, 2020, and remember that at that time, we didn't know that they were, what was going to happen. We didn't know that they were going to reopen remotely in a week, right? We didn't know when they were going to reopen. The crisis was profound. At that same moment, I was facing a personal crisis. My mother suffers from Alzheimer's. She had had an hour a week of care. Suddenly the caregiver wasn't coming, and she was completely disoriented and did not understand what was happening. So I was thinking about caregiving on both ends of life. And I remember a sort of wild-eyed fear of what was to become of us all. And of course, I was thinking of, well, what happens to women? Many of my friends are public school teachers and had children at home while they were teaching online or while they were preparing to teach online. So I was really close to this. And in fact, I had been, in a school on March 12th with an after-school program that shut down on March 13th. So I was really thinking about what happened to children when schools close. And I was thinking about the isolation and the lack of socialization and really that loss of being part of something bigger than oneself. And so my light bulb was a very close to home kind of thing. I live in a very large apartment building, and I decided to organize an art exhibition, and I invited all the people in my building to contribute. And in that way, I actually met a lot of my neighbors, which was cool. Not something people necessarily would have associated with the first week of a pandemic. And so that was great. I'm organizing another one in honor of Delta next month. And of course, the big thing for me was becoming just suddenly immersed in the politics of caregiving, in finding caregivers, in realizing what a terrible shortage there is of caregivers and how poorly they're paid, and what this means for people. My mother lives in another state, so I couldn't even, I couldn't go help her. And understanding that all of this was multiplied by all of us.
So Madeleine already started to sort of touch on this, but looking back over the past year and a half, are there positives you see coming out of the individual and collective struggles over this time? And who wants to start? Actually, yeah, we'll go back to Madeleine.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that a huge positive is just that we're even having conversations like this, that caregiving is a central issue that's being spoken about. There's been significant legislative movement spurred by the pandemic. The infrastructure bill passed today didn't include the initial funding that was proposed for in-home healthcare workers, but just the fact that that was proposed and that caregiving and the value of care being treated as real policy issues, I think is a huge step forward, particularly at the national level. As I said, New York State passed paid sick time law. Just the fact that these are topics of national conversation, I think is a huge step forward and silver lining. The question is, can we keep delivering on it and use the momentum? Biden proposed paid family and medical leave on the national level. That's huge. That's new. Things like that, I think, have been a positive to come out of the pandemic.
Gloria, how about you? What do you see positive coming out of the last year and a half of experience?
So I am going to also talk about the collective experience of racism in many of our communities. So the standout positive for me was more of a silver lining that came out of this really horrible thing, this collective experience of racism for many of us. Personally, the issue of safety particularly hit home as an Asian American woman. Donald Trump's hateful rhetoric around the pandemic put targets on the backs of Asian Americans and manifest in a surge of Asian American hate, most of it experienced by women. In a recent polling by the National Asian Pacific American Women's Association, nearly half of Asian American women have reported experiencing this racism over the last year. But the silver lining and the positive, really great thing that's come out of that is this new awakening in the Asian American community, a sense that all of our sub-communities have a voice and we really have to join together to express that voice. And meanwhile, there's a new attention being paid to Asian American communities. because of the power that we're starting to manifest at the polls. We're the fastest growing voter population. And in the last elections, in almost every state, Asian Americans turned out to vote by double digits. And in Georgia, for example, it rose by 500%. And it was really very decisive in determining the outcome of the Georgia elections and therefore the balance of power in Washington, D.C., which impacts all of us. So for me, the huge positive that's come out of it is very personal because I, of course, am an Asian American woman, but I also see this new focus on Asian Americans, you know, which is so, it touches so much on what it means to be American and what it means to be an immigrant and what it means to be, you know, in this country that's supposed to be built because of immigrants. And I think that that's really positive, and it's a new way forward for redefining us as a country and as a democracy.
And Lynn, how about you? Silver linings, positives?
For me, the big positive is that the ideas that the Black Lives Matter movement so beautifully articulated have really captured the public's imagination. Ideas like we keep each other safe, mutual aid, defunding the police and investing in communities, attending to mental health and destigmatizing mental health. So I want to give a lot of credit there to the Black Lives Matter movement. I had been active in support of the movement before the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, but on June 1st of 2020, I wrote an email to a couple dozen people because I thought we have to do more. Like, we're not doing enough. We're not doing enough every day to address the underlying scourge of racism that has made the inequities that the pandemic was laying bare, right, so much worse. And that initial email became a daily missive called Work from Home for Justice. So I, having lost my job as a museum educator, I found that I could make it my primary work to educate people and organize people, especially people with class privilege. So I was initially addressing educators, artists, activists. The group has grown significantly. So I'm assuming that it is still mostly white educated people, but I don't actually know all the people who read Work from Home from Justice. And writing that newsletter helped to create a conversation so that right around Christmas, somebody got in touch with me and said, you've been writing about these community fridges all around the city. I have a fridge in my basement. Can we set up a community fridge? So we did that. And then that became something. I got contacted by a school, an elementary school teacher, who said, my students want to set up a community fridge. So she invited me to Zoom into her classroom and talk with her students about what that entailed. And they ended up working with our fridge. And the fact that we were having conversations, I was talking to fourth graders about food scarcity and mutual aid and what it means to be part of a community. And they ended up setting up their own community pantry. These things for me are very positive. This is what we should be teaching. And I'm glad that we have this language in common now.
I'm going to stick with you, Lynn, for a moment for the next question, which is, what's one systemic change for working mothers and families that is at or near the top of your current list of priorities? And then shifting towards our audience a little, for alumni looking to expand their own work for systemic change for working mothers, what concrete actions, large or small, would you recommend?
So unsurprisingly, at the top of my list is addressing the need for policies that value care and the work that domestic workers do every day to care for our loved ones. In June, at the last mayoral debate in New York City, I was very pleased that all of the Democratic candidates were talking about the need for expanded childcare. And I thought, finally, we're not having a debate about the need for affordable, available childcare for everyone. Finally, we all know, right? And earlier, Gloria, in a private conversation, mentioned, the baby is on screen when she's in meetings. Like, we are all now seeing what goes on when people are working from home. When I write a lot about caregiving infrastructure and the crisis in the country related to care work and the shortage of care workers. And I often include a content warning that we're all going to get old, right? If we're lucky, and 70% of us are going to need care. Care work touches all of our lives. We are caregivers and we need caregivers. I have been really excited about the work of a group in New York State called New York Caring Majority, which is linked to a national group called Caring Majority Rising. And they have been working on a campaign in New York State called Fair Pay for Home Care. So there are right now in this country about 800,000 older and disabled people who qualify for Medicaid and are on waiting lists for home care. It is likely that this means they're 3 years away, some of them, from getting the care that they need. That's how long the waiting lists are. Private agencies are turning away business because they don't have caregivers. The reason for this is that this is a very low paying job. There are inadequate benefits. This is what creates the shortage. And it affects the quality and the availability of care, and it puts tremendous pressure on families. So there's economic distress for care workers who are overwhelmingly immigrant women of color. And there's every kind of distress for families, right, who need caregivers and can't necessarily get them. There's another group called Care in Action, which is dedicated to organizing women of color and building a coalition to make change. And earlier, Gloria mentioned what happened in Georgia, especially during the senatorial elections, the special elections in January. And one of the reasons why turnout was so good is that there was a lot of canvassing done to talk to women about caregiving issues. So this is my new focus. The other thing that I've been talking about and sort of putting up high on my list of priorities, I got unemployment for the first time in my life in 2020. And there was a big bump to the unemployment because of the federal aid. And suddenly I had this money coming in. And because I have a pension as a public school teacher, I decided I was gonna make targeted donations with this money. And I found that targeting the groups that are, not targeting candidates, but targeting the groups that are doing the canvassing, that are the boots on the ground to organize people and listen to people, was really the best way to do this. Particularly a group, the Frontline, which is a marriage of the Working Families Party and the Movement for Black Lives. So, one thing that folks who want to do more, right, can do, you can sign up for Work from Home for Justice at Substack. And you can use your money and your resources and your voice to advocate for caregivers and for an economy that respects the need for care, that supports families. So that would be top of the line for me, top of mind. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Madeleine, what's top of your list these days, and what are your suggestions for alumni who want to do more, people in our audience?
Well, I'm going to interpret the question like a lawyer and give you some laws that I want to see passed. So, I mean, at the top of my list, there's two things: national paid family and medical leave. You know, as I mentioned, Biden included paid family and medical leave in his initial proposal as part of the American Families Plan. And, you know, various versions have been introduced in recent years, including by Senator Kristen Gillibrand. You know, the USA is still the only country, aside from Papua New Guinea, without a national paid leave program for new moms. And I think only 10 states have it right now. So that's at the very, very top of my list. And the other thing I would say is the National Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which has already been passed by the House of Representatives and is just awaiting to see what will happen in the Senate. And this would be huge. It would basically fill in gaps left in the Federal Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and affirmatively give working women and pregnant people the right to workplace accommodations, regardless of whether they have existing disabilities. They wouldn't have to show anything about how their employer treats other employees. They would just have an affirmative right to that accommodation, which now so many women don't have. So those are two things that are at the top of my list. And in terms of action, I would say, you know, there's so many organizations working on caregiver issues. A Better Balance is working on it. MomsRising is obviously working on it. You know, Lynn mentioned a few other organizations. There's also the Domestic Workers Alliance, the National Employment Law Project, the Center for Work-Life Law. UC Hastings does a lot of great reports on this issue. Legal Aid at Work in California, National Partnership. You know, I would say get on these listservs. These organizations are, you know, have action days and action weeks where you can plug into existing advocacy efforts through social media campaigns, letter writing, legislative outreach. Find people doing work that you support, and, you know, join those mailing lists, or just reach out to them. You know, that would be my advice.
That's great. And Gloria, what's top of your list, and what are your suggestions?
Okay, so I'm going to build on what Lynn was talking about before. So I will get to the policy part, but I think that the one huge systemic change that we're actually seeing happening, but needs to continue to happen, is cultural. Like, we need to break away from the rugged individualism that's so ingrained in our national psyche, which is frankly patriarchal and white supremacist. And we need to embrace community and understanding that no one has to succeed at the expense of anyone else, and that by working together and caring for each other, we can actually all succeed as a nation. Policy-wise, with discussions in Washington around pandemic relief, you know, President Biden's determination to build back better, you know, we have an historic opportunity right now to finally build a care economy, about putting into place the care infrastructure that centers families. And, you know, as Madeleine has mentioned, and also Lynn, this includes like childcare for all, universal paid family and medical leave, making permanent the expanded child tax credit, and other policies that families and businesses need to recover from the pandemic and to thrive moving forward. We're on the edge of actually winning. A suggestion, of course, is to join MomsRising. Please sign up to join MomsRising's email list, where you'll get timely and important opportunities to take action and be part of the fight. I'm in charge of member engagement, so come work directly with me. At the very simplest, you can sign petitions. They really do make a difference. You can find out the right times to make that phone call, to push your lawmaker to make that right vote at the right time. Bring your personal stories to us so that we can amplify them. They are the most powerful way of educating lawmakers to make the right policy decisions, because after all, the personal is the political. So come work with us at MomsRising.
Lots of good concrete suggestions there. I want to be able to get some questions from the audience. So I'm going to kind of conflate the last two questions we planned. Starting with, I'll go back to Lynn. Confronting inequality, advocating for change is challenging work, and we're obviously living in overall challenging times. How have you kept yourself going? Where does your resilience and support come from? And then the last quick question is, you know, as you look ahead, what's making you feel pessimistic? What's making you feel optimistic? Which could be related to how you keep going.
Yes. Meditation group, 8 o'clock every morning, has saved my life. I regularly schedule walks with friends in the park. I take news breaks, especially right before bed. I make sure every day to look at the sky. These are my sanity tools, and I share them with you. Generally speaking, I would say I'm quite optimistic about our collective power to reimagine and remake the world. We are, however, on a tight schedule. The climate crisis is, you know, a red hot disaster, and it is upon us. And I like to remind people that care jobs are green jobs, and that this is actually part of the language that I use when talking about the climate and when talking about the caregiving economy. I just want to turn people on to another group of extraordinary women called Science Moms. The Science Moms are women scientists who have created an incredible, sciencemoms.com, an incredible resource list for people to talk to their children about the climate crisis and to educate themselves and others. They're nonpartisan, and they're having the conversation that we all need to be having, because everything we're talking about, you know, is connected. All of these issues are connected, and the climate is, you know, it's deeply implicated. We are now at a time when mothers are worrying about, you know, how do I evacuate in the event of a wildfire or a flood, right? So my optimism comes from the good work that people are doing, and my sense of urgency, and my sense that I am not doing this work alone.
Thank you. And Madeleine, I'll have you go next. What keeps you going, and what are you feeling optimistic about, pessimistic?
Definitely echo Lynn's, like, get outside, get into nature, look at green things. I think also, just on a more immediate level, like trying to create boundaries between your work and your life, and remembering that taking breaks can be a really positive thing. I think it can be really overwhelming sometimes when you're doing like mission-driven work in the social justice, public interest world, to separate those things. And it can lead to burnout and just emotional exhaustion. So I think taking breaks and stepping back and taking care of yourself in order to then give back to others, even though it sounds like a cliche, it's a cliche because it's true. And then, you know, I'm hopeful and optimistic too. I think that we're in a place where, you know, I can see us moving towards a society that looks at workers as human beings and sees that human beings sometimes have kids or have ailing parents, or sometimes they get sick. And it doesn't mean that they should then have their livelihood and income threatened. And just viewing workers as human beings who live full lives outside of work, I feel like we're on the path to recognizing that as a society, and hopefully policy will follow.
Gloria, how about you? What keeps you going, and what are you feeling pessimistic and optimistic about?
So I think everyone will agree with me that when we wake up in the morning and we see the news headlines, maybe look in our inboxes, it sometimes feels like our problems are really insurmountable. But, you know, I'm also optimistic because, you know, I remind myself actually to take a step back. And when you do that, you can see that actually the big picture, there are actually some really good things are happening. We see really positive changes that don't always make the news and that the news doesn't always frame in a positive light. We're in a historic moment where there's a growing and deepening understanding of racial justice. We're talking about things like oppression. We're talking about white supremacy and structural racism loudly and clearly. Just a few years ago, we could barely utter these terms, even in select company, and there wouldn't be enough common knowledge to be able to have any kind of meaningful discussion. But we're not at that point anymore, especially among younger people, including my kids. At Barnard, there's this understanding of racial justice in profound ways that shapes how they live their lives, they interact with the people in their lives, and it shapes how they think as they prepare to become decision makers and step up to be the leaders that are going to lead us into the future. And I think that that's really exciting and that's really hopeful, and it makes me really proud, and it's what keeps me going.
Well, I'll say more thank yous at the end, but I really, and Jessica will talk a little bit about this at the end too, but this is the end of a 3-part series, and we started with the very personal and the sort of mental health and emotional burden of the pandemic, and then in the middle talked about advocating for yourself at work and getting back into the workforce if you've had to step away, and this, sort of broader systemic issues today. But I think what's been so striking to me listening to all 3 of you is the personal is the systemic, the personal is the political, and just how it's also interwoven in your lives and in the work you're doing. So I thank you for being willing to share that. Let's open things up though to our audience and see if we have any questions. I see one that came in. What sort of support is being offered to children who are suffering silently and may have limited access to mental health services? Anybody have any thoughts or? Lynn?
Well, at least in New York City, there is a new investment in placing more social workers into schools and a commitment to more mental health screening. Every teacher I know has gone through significant training to address social emotional issues, especially during this time. So, the reopening of school and the fact that there are 200,000 young people in New York City's Summer Rising program, it is a good thing. Is a good thing. Nationally, I don't know what the picture is. But here in New York, at least, we're not going to go backward on this, I don't think. I think more resources are going to be devoted to mental health services and social work services in schools. So that's a good thing.
Gloria or Madeleine, you want to weigh in? Right. Other questions? Feel free to add them to the Q&A tab. Anybody who has a question, large or small? Everyone's busy signing up for MomsRising and Work from Home for Justice. All right, well, feel free to write, if you have any last minute questions, but let me turn things over at this point to Jessica Muss, and she'll tell you about her role in all of this series and have a few closing remarks, but encourage people to keep adding questions if you've got them. So Jessica.
Thanks, Christine. Hi, everyone. I am Jessica Muss, the chair of Alma Maters and class of 1998 and the parent of a 2024 Barnard student. I want to thank all of our panelists today for their lively and insightful comments and for sharing their experience and knowledge with all of us. I also want to thank you, Christine, for all of your efforts in organizing this fantastic program, as well as the 2 events that we did prior in this series. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope that you found this discussion to be relevant and super useful. Tonight's webinar was the third and final in a 3-part series devoted to supporting parents during the pandemic. Recording of the first 2, the emotional impact of the pandemic on working mothers and parents, and managing work and career in the age of COVID, what's next for mothers and parents, can be found on the Alumni website under Attend in the Recorded Events Archive section. It might also be listed on our chat right now, I'm not sure. We welcome your feedback. Please keep an eye out for post-event surveys. We love to hear your input and recommendations for further events. Good night, everyone, and be well. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
for listening.
guys. You were awesome.